The human was bleeding from a gash across his forehead when they dragged him into my judgment hall, and the first thing I noticed was not the blood or the chains or the way his wrists had been bound so tightly the skin had turned white. It was his eyes. They were calm in a way that made my stomach drop, because nothing that stood in the royal judgment hall of Isara had any right to be calm. My own generals trembled when they walked across that obsidian floor. My advisors measured every breath before they spoke beneath the vaulted ceiling, where the bones of our ancestors hung in crystalline suspension. But this creature, this human, knelt on the cold stone with the blood running down the side of his face, and looked at me the way someone looks at a painting they find mildly interesting. I had never seen a human before, not in the flesh. I had seen thousands of them in the archives, of course. Every Dravari child grew up watching the holographic war records, the grainy footage of burning colonies and shattered fleets, the carefully narrated documentaries that explained in precise, clinical language exactly what humans were. Predators, persistence hunters from a gravity-dense death world orbiting a violent yellow star, a species that had clawed its way to the top of its food chain not through superior strength or speed or intellect, but through an almost pathological refusal to stop. They did not give up. They did not surrender. They did not show mercy, because mercy was not something their evolution had rewarded. That was the doctrine. That was the scripture. My father, the sovereign of the Dravari, had built his entire military philosophy around a single commandment that every soldier learned before they learned how to fire a weapon. Never engage a human in close quarters. Never trust one that is still breathing. Never allow one inside the border. And now one knelt before me in the heart of our capital, and his eyes were calm. Commander Dreth stepped forward, his ceremonial armor catching the pale light that filtered through the crystalline dome above us. He was my father's most trusted military officer, a veteran of the border conflicts who had earned his rank through decades of service. He carried a data tablet that projected a pale blue holographic display as he activated it. "Your Highness," he said, and I could hear the barely contained satisfaction in his voice. The prisoner was captured at Outpost 7 on the Vareth border. The outpost was destroyed. 14 of our soldiers are dead. This human was found standing among the bodies. A murmur rippled through the court. I could feel the weight of 100 stares, not on the prisoner, but on me. My father was away commanding the fleet along the far border, and in his absence, judgment fell to me. I was 23 cycles old, barely past the age of ascension, and every advisor in the room was watching to see if I would flinch. I did not flinch. I had been trained never to flinch. "What is his designation?" I asked, keeping my voice level. His identification tags mark him as Cade Harlow, combat medic, attached to a human transport vessel called the Harrington. The vessel was disabled in the sector near our outpost. Combat medic. I turned the phrase over in my mind. A healer who fights, or a fighter who heals. The contradiction was very human. Every species in the Galactic Concord had dedicated roles. Warriors fought. Physicians treated wounds. The idea that one individual could do both was something my instructors had pointed to as evidence of human instability. They could not even decide within their own ranks whether they wanted to save lives or end them. "The evidence is clear, Your Highness," Advisor Seelith said from her position beside the throne. She was ancient, her scaled skin faded to a dull silver, and she had served 3 generations of our family. "The human was found at the scene of the attack. Our soldiers are dead. There is no need for deliberation." I looked at the prisoner again. Cade Harlow. He had not spoken since they brought him in. He had not struggled against his chains or bared his teeth, or made any of the aggressive displays the archives had taught me to expect. He simply knelt and breathed, and watched me with those impossibly steady eyes. "Does the prisoner wish to speak?" I asked. Dreth made a sharp sound of disapproval. "Your Highness, human speech is merely a tool for manipulation. The war colleges have documented hundreds of cases where captured humans used language to create false trust before attacking." "Does the prisoner wish to speak?" I repeated, more firmly this time. The hall went silent. Every advisor, every guard, every minor noble who had come to witness the spectacle held their breath. The human lifted his head slightly. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than I expected, scraped raw by whatever had happened to him before the capture, but the words were clear. Did the wounded soldiers I stabilized survive, or did your extraction team arrive too late? The silence that followed was unlike any I had ever experienced in that hall. It was not the respectful quiet that preceded a royal decree, or the tense hush before a verdict. It was confusion, pure, destabilizing confusion, spreading through the court like cracks through ice. "What did you say?" I asked. "Your soldiers," Cade said. "At the outpost, 6 of them were still alive when I reached them, but 3 were critical. Penetrating thoracic trauma, massive fluid loss, 1 with a compromised airway. I did what I could with the supplies I had, but I am not familiar with Dravari physiology at the surgical level. I need to know if they survived." Dreth stepped forward, his hand moving to the sidearm on his belt. "This is exactly the manipulation I warned you about, Your Highness. He is constructing a false narrative to delay his execution. But I was already thinking, already running the variables. If this was a lie, it was a strangely specific one. Most deceptions were built around denial. I did not do it. I was not there. This human was not denying his presence at the outpost. He was claiming he had tried to save my people. Contact the extraction team that recovered the outpost survivors," I said to Dreth. "Now." Dreth hesitated. I saw something flash across his face, something quick and hard to read, and then he turned and spoke into his comm unit. The court waited. I watched the human. He watched me back. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, and then the comm unit crackled with a response. The extraction team commander's voice was thin and distorted by the secure channel, but the words were unmistakable. 6 survivors had been recovered from the outpost. 3 of them had been in critical condition, but had been found with their wounds treated. Field dressings applied with non-standard technique. Improvised tourniquets. A collapsed airway cleared and held open with a piece of tubing that did not match any Dravari medical equipment. Someone had kept those soldiers alive. Someone who was not Dravari. I looked at Cade Harlow, and for the first time in my life, the doctrine did not fit. The archives had not prepared me for this. The holographic war records, and the carefully narrated documentaries, and the precise, clinical language had never once described a human kneeling in chains with calm eyes, asking whether the alien soldiers he had treated were still breathing. "Take the prisoner to the high-security detention level," I said. "He is not to be harmed. He is not to be executed. Not until I have completed a full investigation." The court erupted. Advisor Seleth's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Your Highness, with all due respect, the doctrine is clear. A live human inside our capital is an unacceptable risk. Your father would never permit this." "My father is not here," I said. "I am." I descended from the throne platform and walked toward the prisoner. Every guard in the room tensed. I could feel the fear radiating off them like heat. Here was their princess, walking toward the most dangerous creature their species had ever encountered, close enough that he could lunge and reach her throat before anyone could react. Cade Harlow did not lunge. He did not even shift his weight. He looked up at me, and from this distance I could see the details the archives had never captured. The fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the dried blood caked in the stubble along his jaw, the way his hands, even bound, were held open rather than clenched. Not the posture of a predator, the posture of someone who had stopped fighting a long time ago, not out of surrender, but out of choice. "Why?" I asked him quietly, so that only he could hear. "If what you claim is true, why did you help them? They were not your species. They were not your allies. Their people have spent decades calling yours monsters." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something that I would carry with me for the rest of my life, something that would burrow into my mind and eat through every certainty I had ever built. "Your soldiers screamed for help. I did not check what species they were before I answered." The guards took him away. I stood in the center of the judgment hall, surrounded by advisors who were already talking over each other, already spinning strategies and political calculations and risk assessments. But I did not hear any of them. I was standing very still, feeling something crack inside the architecture of everything I had been taught, a hairline fracture running through the foundation of my understanding of what humans were. It should not have mattered. One act of apparent compassion from a single prisoner did not erase centuries of documented human aggression. One claim of battlefield mercy did not outweigh the holographic archives full of burning worlds and shattered civilizations. The doctrine existed for a reason. The commandments existed for a reason. My people had survived this long because they understood what humans were and acted accordingly. But as I walked back to the throne and the court slowly settled into its uneasy silence, I could not stop thinking about the look in his eyes. The calm, not the calm of a predator who knows it is in control. The calm of someone who has done the only thing they could do and is at peace with whatever comes next. I retired to my private chambers that evening and pulled up the outpost incident report on my personal console. I read it 3 times. Then I read it again. The timeline was clear, the evidence was catalogued, and the conclusion was clean. A human combatant had attacked a Dravari outpost, killed 14 soldiers, and been captured at the scene. But timelines could be manipulated, evidence could be arranged, and conclusions were only as honest as the people who wrote them. I opened a secondary channel and requested the raw sensor data from the outpost's automated monitoring system. If the system had survived the attack, it would contain unedited footage of everything that had happened. No narration, no conclusions, just the truth. The request would take hours to process. I sat in the dark of my chambers and waited, and for the first time in my life, I was not sure I wanted to know the answer. Because if the human was telling the truth, then the doctrine was wrong. And if the doctrine was wrong, then everything built on top of it, every military decision, every diplomatic refusal, every generation of fear and isolation and certainty, was built on a lie. And the most terrifying part was not that the lie might exist. It was that I might be the only one in the entire sovereignty willing to look at it. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the blue glow of my console and waited for the truth. And somewhere beneath me, deep in the vaults below the palace, a human combat medic named Cade Harlow sat in a cell and waited for whatever I would decide. And neither of us knew yet that the answer would change everything. I started the interrogations the next morning, not because I believed him. I want to be clear about that. I went down to the detention level with every intention of breaking his story apart, of finding the seam in his deception and pulling until the whole facade came undone. I had reviewed every intelligence briefing on human psychological tactics. I knew about their pattern of building false rapport. I knew they could modulate their voices to trigger trust responses in other species. I knew that their facial expressions were unreliable, that what looked like sincerity could be calculated performance. I walked into the interrogation chamber armored in certainty, and I told myself I would walk out the same way. The chamber was small and cold, carved from the same dark stone as the rest of the detention level. Cade sat behind a reinforced barrier, his wrists still bound, though someone had cleaned the blood from his face and given him water. He looked up when I entered, and there it was again. The calm, that infuriating, inexplicable calm. "I have questions," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "I figured you might." I activated the data projector embedded in the table between us and began pulling up files. Images of burned cities, orbital bombardment scars on colony worlds, mass graves on Thesara Prime. The holographic records flickered in the dim room, casting pale light across both our faces. "These are the actions of your species over the past 200 cycles," I said. "Documented, verified, and catalogued by 12 independent galactic intelligence agencies. Would you like to deny any of them?" He looked at the images for a long time. I watched his face carefully, searching for the flinch, the deflection, the pivot to justification that the intelligence briefings had told me to expect. Instead, he studied each image with a quiet attention that I did not know how to categorize. "No," he said. "I would not deny any of them." That was not what I expected. Denial was the first tool in the human deception playbook. Every briefing said so. Deny, deflect, reframe. But he had skipped straight past denial and landed on something I had no protocol for. "You admit that your species has committed these acts." I admit that humans did these things. Yes. Some of them were soldiers, following orders they should have refused. Some of them were governments, making calculations that treated lives as numbers. Some of them were frightened people who convinced themselves that cruelty was the same thing as strength. He paused. They were wrong. But they were still human, and I do not get to pretend they were not. I leaned forward. Then how can you possibly claim to be different? You come from the same world. You carry the same biology. The same aggression is coded into your genes. It is, he said, and the simplicity of the admission caught me off guard again. Every human who has ever lived has carried the capacity for extraordinary violence inside them. It is part of what we are. Our ancestors survived because they could be more persistent, more creative, and more ruthless than anything else on our planet. He met my eyes. But that is only half the story, and your archives only tell the first half. Enlighten me then. What is the second half? The same biology that makes us capable of terrible things also makes us capable of terrible compassion. The same stubbornness that kept our ancestors chasing prey across continents also kept them sitting beside sick children through the night, refusing to give up on them. The same creativity that invented weapons also invented medicine and art and music that can make a room full of strangers cry together. He leaned forward slightly, and the chains clinked against the table. You are not wrong about what we are, Princess. You are wrong about what that means. The violence is real, but so is everything else. And the thing that makes humans actually dangerous, the thing your archives never figured out, is that we get to choose. Every single time, with every single breath, we choose which part of ourselves to act on, and that choice is the most powerful force in the galaxy. I sat with that for a moment, letting the words settle into the architecture of my understanding, feeling them press against the walls I had built. It was elegant. It was almost convincing, and it was exactly the kind of sophisticated psychological manipulation that a well-trained human operative would deploy. Choices, I repeated. You are telling me that you chose to save my soldiers at the outpost? Yes. Why? Because they were dying, and I could help. That is not an answer. That is a deflection. What did you gain from saving enemy combatants? What strategic advantage? What leverage were you creating? For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not frustration, but something quieter. Something that looked, against every briefing I had ever read, like sadness. I am a combat medic, he said. I took an oath. I do not get to decide who deserves to live based on what uniform they are wearing. A wound is a wound. A dying person is a dying person. If I start making exceptions, if I start letting politics or doctrine or fear decide who I help, then I am not a healer anymore. I am just another weapon. I ended the first session and returned to my chambers. The raw sensor data from the outpost had arrived overnight, and I spent the next 4 hours reviewing it frame by frame. What I found made me sit very still for a long time afterward. The outpost had not been attacked by a human. The sensor logs were fragmented but clear enough. The attacking force had been Vrethic. Their energy signatures were unmistakable, the jagged pulse patterns that no other species in the region used. A Vrethic raiding party had hit the outpost hard and fast, overwhelmed the garrison, and withdrawn before reinforcements could arrive. Cade Harlow appeared in the sensor data 17 minutes after the attack ended. He approached from the northeast, alone, on foot, carrying a medical bag. The sensors tracked him entering the outpost through a breach in the outer wall. He moved from body to body, checking for survivors. When he found one, he stopped. He knelt. He worked. For over 2 hours, while Dravari reinforcements scrambled to reach the remote outpost, a human combat medic crawled through the wreckage of an alien military installation and kept 6 soldiers alive with improvised techniques and scavenged supplies. He spoke to them too. The audio was mostly corrupted, but in one fragment I could hear his voice, low and steady, saying something to a wounded soldier who was crying out in pain. I could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. He was telling the soldier it would be all right. The Dravari reinforcement team arrived and found him there. A human, standing in a destroyed outpost, surrounded by dead Dravari soldiers, his hands covered in alien blood. They had not checked the sensor logs. They had not looked at the timeline. They had seen what they expected to see, what the doctrine told them they would see, and they had acted accordingly. I called Dreth to my chambers. He arrived within minutes, his armor polished, his posture rigid. I showed him the sensor data without commentary, and watched his face as the truth played out on the display. He did not look surprised. That was what told me everything I needed to know. He did not look surprised because he already knew. "Commander," I said carefully, "when did you become aware that the Vrethik were responsible for the attack on Outpost 7? Dreth was silent for 3 full seconds. Then he straightened his shoulders and met my gaze with the practiced steadiness of a career military officer who has decided to commit to a position. The political value of a captured human outweighed the operational relevance of the Vrethik incursion, he said. Our fleet needed a justification for increased border funding. A Vrethik raid on a minor outpost would not have provided that. A human attack on sovereign Dravari territory, however, changes the calculus entirely. You falsified the incident report. I prioritized the security interests of the sovereignty. You let an innocent being face execution for a crime he did not commit. He is human, Your Highness. The word innocent does not apply. I dismissed him. After he left, I sat alone in my chambers and felt something I had never experienced before. It was not doubt. Doubt implies uncertainty, a wavering between two possibilities. This was worse than doubt. This was clarity. Sudden, sharp, merciless clarity that cut through every comfortable assumption I had built my life on and left me staring at the raw, ugly infrastructure underneath. The doctrine was not wrong because it exaggerated the threat. The doctrine was wrong because it had been designed to prevent exactly what was happening to me right now. It existed not to protect the Dravari from humans, but to protect the Dravari from ever having to see humans clearly. Because a species that you understand is a species you might empathize with. And a species you empathize with is a species you can no longer use as a convenient enemy to justify your military budgets and your political consolidation and your neat, comfortable fear. I went back to the detention level that evening. Cade was sitting in the same position, as if he had not moved in hours. Maybe he had not. When I entered, he looked up, and this time I saw something new in his expression. Not hope, exactly. Something more careful than hope. Awareness, maybe. The recognition that something had shifted. I reviewed the sensor data from the outpost, I said. The Vrethik attacked it, not you. He nodded slowly. I know. You knew they would blame you. When the reinforcements arrived and found you there, you knew exactly what they would assume. Yes. And you did not fight them. You did not run. You let them take you. I had 3 soldiers in critical condition. If I had fought your people, or tried to run, the chaos would have distracted the medics. Those soldiers would have died. He paused, so I put my hands up and let them put the chains on. You sacrificed your freedom to protect the lives of enemy soldiers who would have celebrated your death. They were not enemies. They were patients. I stood there in the cold light of the detention chamber and felt the last of my certainty dissolve like frost under a heat lamp. This man had walked into the wreckage of an alien outpost, saved 6 lives, and then surrendered himself to certain execution rather than risk those lives by resisting arrest. Not for strategy, not for leverage, not for any of the calculated reasons the intelligence briefings insisted were the only reasons humans ever did anything. He had done it because the people he saved were dying and he could help. I believe you, I said. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I saw the first crack in his composure. Just a flicker, a tremor at the corner of his mouth, a brief tightness around his eyes. Then it passed, and he opened his eyes and looked at me again. Thank you, he said quietly. Do not thank me yet. My court wants you dead. My military advisors have built a political strategy around your capture that they will not abandon willingly, and my father, the sovereign, will return in 10 days, and his opinion of humans is considerably less flexible than mine. So what happens now? I did not have an answer for that. I did not have an answer for any of it. The foundation of my world had cracked, and I was standing on the pieces, trying to figure out which ones could still hold weight, and which ones would crumble if I stepped on them. What happened next was that the galaxy made the decision for me. The emergency transmission came in at the 3rd hour past midnight. I was still awake, still sitting in my chambers reviewing the outpost sensor data for the 4th time, still trying to reconcile the world I had been taught with the world I was now seeing, when the priority alert shattered the silence like a hammer through glass. Vrethic forces were massing on the edge of Dravari space. Not a raiding party this time. A full assault fleet, dozens of warships, troop carriers, orbital bombardment platforms. And their target was Verath Colony, a settlement world on the far border that housed over 60,000 civilians. I reached the War Council chamber within minutes. The senior commanders were already there, their faces tight with controlled urgency as the tactical display painted the situation in stark holographic detail. The Vrethic fleet was already in transit. At their current speed, they would reach Verath Colony in 12 hours. Our fleet was out of position. My father had taken the bulk of our warships to the far border in response to the original outpost incident, chasing the ghost of a human threat that had never existed, while the real enemy had been repositioning for a killing stroke. The nearest Dravari battle group could not reach Verath Colony for 36 hours at maximum speed. 12 hours until the Vrethic arrived. 36 hours until our fleet could respond. 24 hours of empty space between our civilians and annihilation. What assets do we have at the colony? I demanded. A defense garrison of 200 soldiers, Commander Dreth reported. Light weapons, no orbital defense platforms, no atmospheric fighters. The colony was classified as a low-threat settlement zone. 60,000 civilians, I said. Children, elderly, families relocated to the border settlements during the expansion, and we classified them as low threat. The silence in the room was heavy. I watched the tactical display cycling through scenarios, watched the projected casualty numbers climb with each simulation, watched my military commanders begin the cold arithmetic of acceptable losses. I could see it in their faces. They were already writing the colony off. We need to discuss evacuation timelines, Advisor Seelith began. There are no evacuation timelines, Dreth interrupted. We do not have enough transport capacity within range to evacuate 60,000 civilians in 12 hours. We could save perhaps 8 to 10,000 if we begin immediately and prioritize the youngest. And the rest? Another silence. Dreth did not answer. He did not have to. I stared at the tactical display and felt something inside me harden into a point of absolute clarity. This was happening because of a lie. The Vrethic had probed our outpost to test our response. Our response had been to blame a human, to mobilize our fleet in the wrong direction, to chase a fabricated threat while the real one gathered strength. Every decision that had led to this moment could be traced back to the doctrine, to the certainty that humans were the enemy, to the refusal to see the truth when it knelt in chains before us and asked if the soldiers it had saved were still alive. I left the War Council and went to the detention level. The guards challenged me, told me it was against protocol to visit the prisoner outside of scheduled interrogation windows. I told them to open the door or find new careers. They opened the door. Cade was sitting on the narrow bench in his cell. He looked up when I entered, and something in my expression must have told him this was not another interrogation. Something happened, he said. I told him, all of it. The Vrethic fleet, the colony, the 60,000 civilians, the gap between the threat and the response. I told him not as a request but as a confession, as if speaking the truth out loud, to the only person in the palace who had proven he could be trusted with it, might somehow make it more bearable. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me a question that I will remember until the day I stop breathing. Do you have a ship that can get me there? Not us, not your soldiers, me. A single human, chained in a cell in the heart of an alien capital, hearing that 60,000 strangers of a species that had imprisoned him and tried to execute him were about to die, and his first response was to ask how he could help. You want to go to a colony full of people whose military framed you for murder and fight an alien invasion force alone. Not alone. You said there is a garrison of 200 soldiers. If I can reach the colony before the Vrethic, I can help them organize a defense, establish triage points, set up civilian evacuation corridors, identify defensive choke points. I have done this before. Different planet, different species, but the principles are the same. The garrison will never follow a human's orders. They will, if someone with authority tells them to, someone they respect, someone who outranks everyone on that colony by a significant margin. He looked at me steadily. Someone like a princess. I understood what he was suggesting. He was not just asking me to release him, he was asking me to go with him, to fly to a besieged colony on the far border, to put myself in the path of an invasion fleet, and to stake my authority on the word of a species my people had feared for centuries. It was reckless. It was politically catastrophic. It was quite possibly suicidal. And it was the only plan anyone had presented that night that did not begin with calculating acceptable civilian casualties. My advisors will try to stop me, I said. Probably. If you betray me, if this is some elaborate deception, my death will start a war between our species that will burn across the galaxy for generations. I know. So give me a reason. One reason to trust you. He held up his bound hands. The skin beneath the shackles was raw and abraded, the marks of days in confinement. I have been in this cell for 4 days, he said. In that time, I have not once asked you to release me. I have not bargained for my freedom. I have not threatened or pleaded or tried to manipulate you. The only thing I have asked you, from the moment they dragged me into your judgment hall, is whether the soldiers I saved were still alive. He lowered his hands. That is who I am. That is what I do. And right now, 60,000 people need someone who does what I do. I made the decision in that moment. Not with logic, not with strategy, not with the careful political calculus that my upbringing demanded. I made it with something deeper and older than any of that. I made it with the part of me that had heard a chained prisoner ask about the welfare of his captors and felt the first crack in the architecture of everything I believed. I will have them prepare a fast courier ship, I said. You will be given medical supplies, communication equipment, and a garrison command override sealed with my authority, and I will be on that ship with you. Your Highness, that is not necessary. It is absolutely necessary. If I send you alone, the garrison will put a round through your head before you finish your first sentence. You need me there to make them listen, and I need to be there, because if what you claim about humans is true, if you really can do what you say you can do, then I need to see it. With my own eyes, because right now, I am about to bet 60,000 lives on the word of a species I was raised to fear, and I will not do that from the safety of a palace. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I did not expect. He smiled. Not a grin or a smirk, or any of the aggressive facial displays the archives had catalogued. A small, quiet, tired smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. Then let us go save some people, Princess. The fast courier ship launched from the palace's private docking bay 40 minutes later. I had told Dreth and Seleth what I was doing, not asked them, and the expressions on their faces would have been amusing under different circumstances. Dreth had actually tried to physically block the docking bay door before 2 of my personal guards moved him aside. The ship was small and fast, designed for diplomatic runners and intelligence couriers. It had no weapons, minimal shielding, and enough fuel to reach Veroth Colony in just under 8 hours. That would give us approximately 4 hours on the ground before the Vrethic arrived. 4 hours to turn a settlement colony with no meaningful defenses into something that could survive an assault by a full invasion fleet. It was not enough time. I knew that. Cade knew that. But it was the time we had. He spent the first 2 hours of the flight reviewing everything I could provide about the colony's layout, infrastructure, terrain, and population distribution. He asked questions I would not have thought to ask. Where were the underground utility corridors? What were the walls of the residential structures made of? Did the colony have mining or industrial equipment? What was the age and fitness distribution of the civilian population? Were there natural choke points in the terrain around the settlement? I watched him work, and I began to see something that no archive or briefing had ever shown me. I had been taught that human intelligence was crude, that their problem-solving was based on brute force trial and error, rather than the elegant analytical frameworks my species prized. But what I saw in Cade's mind was not crude at all. It was fluid and adaptive, making connections between seemingly unrelated pieces of information at a speed that left me struggling to follow. The mining facility on the colony's eastern edge, he said, pointing at the layout schematic. It has heavy industrial equipment, power generators, and most importantly, reinforced structures built to withstand blasting pressure. That becomes our fallback point and civilian shelter. The residential district is on the western side. Moving 60,000 people across the colony in 4 hours is not possible. We do not move 60,000. We move the most vulnerable first, the children and the elderly, and anyone who cannot contribute to defense. Everyone else gets a role. Your garrison soldiers hold the perimeter. Able-bodied civilians assist with fortification, supply transport, and casualty extraction. Nobody sits idle. You are suggesting we arm civilians. I am suggesting we give every person in that colony a reason to believe they can survive this. If your people believe they are already dead, they will act like it. If they believe they have a chance, they will fight for it. And humans? Well, any species that believes it has a chance can do extraordinary things. We dropped out of faster-than-light transit, within visual range of Vareth colony, and the first thing I saw was smoke. Thin columns of it rising from the settlement's outer ring, where the Vrethic scout ships had already begun their harassment runs. Small, fast attack craft, not the main fleet, but enough to spread terror through a population that had no way to fight back. The courier ship landed on the colony's central administrative pad, and we stepped out into chaos. Civilians were running through the streets, some carrying children, some carrying belongings, some simply running without direction or purpose. The garrison soldiers were deployed in scattered clusters, their formation discipline crumbling under the weight of a threat they had never been trained to face. An officer was shouting orders that no one was following. Kate stood on the landing pad and took it all in with a single sweeping look. Then he turned to me and said, "Introduce me now. Every second we waste is a second we do not get back." I activated the colony-wide communication system from the administrative center, overriding the local command authority with my royal clearance codes. My voice echoed from every speaker, every personal comm device, every public address terminal across the settlement. This is Princess Valith of the Dravari Sovereignty. I am on the ground at Varath Colony. A Vrethic invasion fleet will arrive in approximately 4 hours. Our fleet cannot reach us in time. But we are not defenseless. I have brought someone who will help us organize our defense, someone who has already saved Dravari lives at great personal cost. He is human, and you will follow his instructions as you would follow mine. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel 60,000 people holding their breath. And then Cade stepped forward, and his voice filled the colony through the same speakers, calm and steady, and carrying a certainty that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with competence. My name is Cade Harlow. I am a combat medic. I have defended civilian populations under siege before, and I am going to help you do the same thing today. Here is what I need from you. He began issuing orders, not like a general barking commands from a safe distance, like a surgeon directing an operating room, precise, specific, and urgent, but never panicked. Garrison soldiers to defensive positions along the colony's natural terrain barriers. Civilian teams to begin moving children and elderly to the mining facility shelters. Engineering crews to disable the colony's exterior lighting grid so the Vrethic would lose easy targeting reference. Medical staff to establish 3 triage stations at calculated intervals between the perimeter and the shelter. And then, something happened that I will carry with me until the stars go dark. The Dravari listened, not because they trusted him, not because they believed in him, but because in the middle of terror, when the sky was darkening with the promise of fire, and the people they had relied on for protection were visibly failing them, a voice cut through the noise and told them what to do, and the voice was calm, and it was specific, and it was not afraid. Soldiers who had been trained since childhood to fear humans began moving to the positions he designated. Civilians who had been running in blind panic began forming into the teams he organized. Engineers who had been standing frozen at their posts began carrying out the modifications he described. He moved through the colony like a current through water, and everywhere he went, the chaos smoothed into purpose. I followed him, not because I needed to supervise, but because I could not look away. He stopped to help a group of elderly Dravari who were struggling to reach the shelter, lifting bags and steadying arms, with a gentleness that seemed impossible in someone who was simultaneously planning a military defense. He knelt beside a garrison soldier who was hyperventilating with fear and spoke to her quietly for 30 seconds, until her breathing steadied and she returned to her post. He showed a team of civilian volunteers how to stack construction materials into barriers that would absorb energy weapon fire, and he did it with a patience that made them feel like partners rather than conscripts. 3 hours passed. The colony transformed. What had been a sprawling, vulnerable settlement became something else. Not a fortress, not by any military definition, but something that had structure and intention, and the quiet, stubborn defiance of 60,000 people who had decided they would rather fight than die waiting. Cade stood on the roof of the administrative center, looking out over the colony as the last of the preparations fell into place. I stood beside him. The sky was darkening, and on the edge of the horizon, I could see the first flickers of light that were not stars. "They are coming," I said. He nodded. He was looking out at the colony with an expression I had never seen on any face, human or Dravari. It was not fear, it was not determination. It was something between prayer and promise, the look of someone who has already decided what they are willing to pay for the outcome they need. "Stay behind me when it starts, Princess," he said quietly. "This is the part your archives got right." The first Vrethic landing craft hit the outer perimeter like a hammer blow, and the world cracked open. The night erupted with sound and light, the shriek of atmospheric engines, the crack of energy weapons, the deep concussive thud of landing craft slamming into the ground hard enough to shake buildings 3 blocks away. Dozens of them, then dozens more, the sky filling with dark shapes that blotted out the stars as the invasion fleet disgorged its ground forces. Cade was already moving before the first craft touched down. He had positioned himself at the primary defensive line along the colony's northern approach, where the terrain funneled any ground advance through a narrow corridor between the mining facility and a rocky ridge. It was the kind of choke point that a textbook would call defensible, but textbooks did not account for the sheer volume of Vrethic pouring through it. I watched him fight, and I understood in that moment why my people feared humans. He was not stronger than the Vrethic. He was not faster. He was not better armed. But he moved with a fluidity that seemed to operate outside the normal constraints of combat. He read the battlefield the way a musician reads a score, seeing patterns and rhythms that others could not, anticipating movements before they happened, exploiting gaps that existed for fractions of a second. He used the terrain, the debris, the smoke, the confusion itself as tools. When a wall collapsed under fire, he used the rubble as cover. When a Vrethic squad tried to flank the position, he had already repositioned the garrison soldiers to meet them. And the Dravari soldiers followed him. Not because they had been ordered to, not because they had overcome their fear of humans, but because in the crucible of combat, when the difference between living and dying was measured in decisions made in heartbeats, they could see that his decisions were keeping them alive. The first wave broke against the defensive line. It cost us. I could see the wounded being carried back to the triage stations, could hear the calls for medics echoing through the smoke. But the line held. The corridor was choked with fallen Vrethic, and the second wave had to slow their advance to navigate the debris. Cade used those purchased minutes to reorganize the defense, shifting soldiers from quieter sectors to reinforce the points under heaviest pressure. He communicated constantly, his voice on the garrison frequency calm and precise, calling out positions and movements with an economy of language that left no room for confusion. Then the Vrethic changed tactics. Instead of continuing the ground assault through the choke point, they began landing troops on the colony's eastern flank, targeting the residential district. The garrison there was thin, just a holding force designed to delay rather than stop, and the residential district still held civilians who had not yet reached the shelter, families who had been slower to evacuate, people who had gone back for belongings or pets, or simply been too frightened to move. Cade heard the reports coming in and made a decision that I did not understand until later. He pulled himself off the primary defensive line, left it under the command of the garrison's senior officer, and ran toward the eastern district. I followed him because I could not do anything else. Because the gravity of his certainty was stronger than my fear, and because somewhere in the last 12 hours, I had stopped being a princess, observing a crisis, and started being someone fighting through one. The eastern residential district was a nightmare. Vrethik shock troops were moving through the streets, their heavy frames smashing through doorways and walls. I could hear screaming from the buildings. Cade moved through the chaos with a precision that was terrifying to watch, clearing Vrethik from building after building, but between every engagement, between every moment of the violence that my archives had documented so meticulously, he stopped. He stopped to pull a wounded Dravari child from beneath a collapsed wall panel, shielding her with his own body as debris rained down. He stopped to carry an elderly man who could not walk from a burning residential block, setting him down gently behind a barrier before turning back toward the fighting. He stopped to tie a tourniquet on a garrison soldier whose arm had been shattered by a Vrethik concussion round, and when the soldier looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, Cade said, "You are going to be fine. Stay behind this wall. The medics are coming." And the soldier believed him, because it was impossible not to believe someone whose voice carried that much steady conviction. I watched him move between violence and mercy without transition, without hesitation, without any indication that the two acts occupied different compartments in his mind. He fought with a ferocity that would have confirmed every fear my people had ever harbored about humans. And then he healed with a gentleness that demolished every certainty those fears were built on. And the transition between the two was seamless. It was not a switch being flipped. It was both things existing simultaneously, the capacity for terrible destruction and the capacity for terrible compassion, operating together like two hands belonging to the same body. That was when I understood, standing in the smoke and the fire and the screaming, watching a human tear through an alien invasion force and then kneel to comfort a frightened child without breaking stride. I understood what he had been trying to tell me in the interrogation chamber. He was not a killer or a redeemer. He was both. He was always both. And the fact that he could be both, that he could hold those contradictions inside himself without being destroyed by them, was not a flaw in human design. It was the design. It was the whole point. The Eastern District was secured. Barely. At a cost measured in blood and exhaustion. Cade directed the remaining civilians to the shelter, and then turned back toward the primary defensive line, where the fighting had intensified. The Vrethik had committed their reserves, and the garrison was buckling under the pressure. We ran through streets that smelled like ozone and burning metal, and somewhere during that run, a Vrethik energy round caught Cade across the ribs. I saw him stagger, saw the dark line of scorched flesh appear through the torn fabric of his shirt, saw him grit his teeth and keep running. He did not stop. He did not slow down. He pressed his hand against the wound and kept moving, as if the pain were an inconvenience he had chosen to deal with later. We reached the primary line as it was on the verge of collapse. Cade threw himself back into the command position, his voice on the garrison frequency cutting through the chaos with the calm authority of someone who refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. He redistributed forces, called for the reserve teams he had positioned at the mining facility, and organized a counterattack that pushed the Vrethik back from the choke point by sheer force of coordinated will. The battle ground on. Hours blurred into each other. The colony's exterior was shattered, buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks, streets cratered and choked with debris, but the defensive line held. The triage stations kept operating. The shelter remained secure. And through all of it, Cade Harlow moved between the fighting and the healing, between the destruction and the compassion, never stopping, never choosing one over the other, never pretending that he was anything other than exactly what he was. A human, complete, unedited. Both halves of the story at once. The moment I knew we were in real trouble was when the garrison's sensor operator, a young soldier named Tail, whose hands had not stopped shaking since the first landing craft, touched down, looked at his display, and went completely still. "Your Highness," he said, and his voice had the flat quality of someone who has moved past fear into something worse. "A Vrethik capital ship has entered orbit. Dreadnought class. It is charging its orbital bombardment array." The fighting on the ground had been survivable. Desperate, costly, brutal, but survivable, because we had terrain and barriers, and the stubborn architecture of a colony, built to withstand the geological pressures of a border world. An orbital bombardment changed everything. A Dreadnought-class bombardment array could reduce every structure on the surface to molten slag in minutes. No barrier, no choke point, no amount of tactical brilliance could protect against fire falling from the sky. Cade was at the command station within seconds of the report. His face was gray with exhaustion, the wound across his ribs still seeping through the field dressing he had applied to himself between engagements. He stared at the sensor display showing the capital ship's position in high orbit, and I saw something I had never seen in his expression before. Not fear, calculation. The rapid, intense computation of someone searching for an answer that might not exist. "The mining facility," he said. "You mentioned it has a mass driver for launching ore into orbital collection barges." "Yes, it has been decommissioned for 3 cycles. The colony switched to surface transport." "Is it still functional? Could it be powered up?" I contacted the mining facility's chief engineer, a steady older Dravari named Kareth, who had been coordinating the civilian shelter operations. She confirmed the mass driver was still physically intact. It had not been maintained, and the targeting systems had been stripped for parts, but the core mechanism, the electromagnetic acceleration rail, was still functional. Cade nodded slowly. "A mass driver designed to launch ore into orbit. If we load it with the densest material available and aim it at the capital ship's engine cluster, the kinetic energy alone would be catastrophic." "The targeting systems are gone," Kareth reminded us over the comm. "Someone would have to aim it manually." "Manual aim from where?" "The external control platform. It is on the upper level of the facility, above the acceleration rail, direct line of sight to the target." "And the platform has no shielding," I said, because I could already see where this was going, and I needed to say it out loud before the reality of it settled into my chest. "No shielding," Kareth confirmed. "It was designed for maintenance observation. Once the mass driver fires, the backwash alone would be significant. And if the capital ship detects the launch and targets the platform with point defense fire, the operator would have no protection." Cade was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that fills a room and makes everyone in it stop breathing. "How long to power up the mass driver and load a projectile?" 20 minutes if we push it." "Then start pushing." He turned away from the command station and walked toward the door. I caught his arm. The contact surprised both of us, I think. Dravari did not touch humans. The doctrine was very clear about that. But the doctrine was already in ruins, and my hand closed around his forearm before the reflex could be overridden. "You are not going up there," I said. "Someone has to aim it, Princess." "Then someone from the garrison. Someone trained in weapons systems. Your garrison has never operated a mass driver. They have never done manual targeting against a moving orbital object. I have. Not exactly this scenario, but close enough. Kinetic bombardment countermeasures were part of my training before I switched to medical. I know the physics, I know the timing, and more importantly, I know how to stay calm while doing math under fire, which is the part that actually matters." "You will die up there." "Maybe." He said it with the same tone he had used to describe the wound across his ribs, an acknowledgement of pain that did not change the course of action. "But if nobody goes up there, 60,000 people die in the next 30 minutes when that dreadnought fires its bombardment array. And I did not spend the last 12 hours keeping them alive just to watch them burn, because I was afraid of a bad outcome." I did not release his arm. I could feel the heat of his skin through the torn fabric, the steady pulse beneath the surface, the reality of him, in a way that no archive or holographic record could ever capture. He was not a theory, he was not a doctrine. He was a person who was choosing to walk toward his own death because the alternative was allowing others to die, and that calculation was so simple and so clear in his mind that he was almost peaceful about it. "You once asked me why I saved your soldiers at the outpost," he said quietly. "I told you I did not check what species they were before I answered. That is still true. It will always be true. Species does not matter. Uniforms do not matter. The only thing that matters is that someone needs help, and I can provide it. That is not a strategy or a deception or a psychological manipulation. It is just what I am." I released his arm. There was nothing I could say that would change his mind, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that trying to stop him would dishonor the very thing I had come to believe about him. He had the right to choose. That was what made him human. Not the violence and not the compassion, but the choice itself. "I will maintain communication with you from the command station," I said. "We will guide you through the targeting." He nodded. Then he did something that shattered the last wall between the world I had been taught and the world that actually existed. He reached out and placed his hand briefly on my shoulder. A human gesture of connection, of reassurance, of shared weight. The Dravari did not have an equivalent. We had nothing in our entire cultural lexicon that mapped to the simple act of one person touching another to say, "I see you, I am with you, we are in this together." "Take care of them, princess," he said. "Whatever happens up there, take care of them." He left. I watched him go, and I did not allow myself to look away until he had disappeared around the corner of the corridor. Then I turned back to the command station and became the person he needed me to be. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. Kareth's engineering team powered up the mass driver, while Cade made his way through the mining facility to the external control platform. I tracked his progress on the internal sensors, watching the small indicator that represented his position move through the facility's corridors and stairwells, climbing toward the exposed platform above the acceleration rail. The Vrethic capital ship was completing its orbital positioning. The bombardment array was charging. We had minutes. Cade reached the platform and activated the manual control interface. His voice came through the comm, roughened by exhaustion and pain, but steady. Always steady. "I have visual on the target. Adjusting elevation. The engine cluster is on the ventral surface, slightly aft of center. I need you to give me the orbital velocity and bearing corrections." Kareth fed him the numbers. He repeated them back, confirming each value with the precision of someone for whom accuracy was not a preference but a moral obligation. I could hear the wind on the platform, the distant sound of the ground battle still raging on the colony's perimeter, and beneath it all, the low electrical hum of the mass driver powering up. "Projectile loaded," Kareth reported. "Acceleration rail at 87% capacity. Recommend firing at 90 or above for reliable orbital velocity." "Understood. Talk to me, princess." I was not sure what he meant, until I realized he was asking me to keep the communication line open. Not for tactical data, not for targeting corrections. He wanted to hear a voice. He was standing on an exposed platform with no shielding, aiming a repurposed mining tool at a warship in orbit, and he wanted to hear a voice. "The children in the shelter are safe," I told him. "All of them. The garrison is holding the perimeter. The triage stations are still operating. The things you built today are holding, Cade. They are holding. Good. That is good." A pause. "Tell me something else. Tell me something that is not about the battle." "What?" "Anything. Tell me about Dravari poetry. Tell me about what the sky looks like on your homeworld at sunset. Tell me something beautiful." So I did. While the mass driver charged, and the capital ship's bombardment array glowed with accumulating energy, and the fate of 60,000 lives hung in the space between a mining platform and the stars, I told a human about the crystal formations on Asara that caught the light of our twin suns and scattered it into colors that our language had 14 words for, because a single word could never capture the range. I told him about the poems my mother used to recite, poems about the space between stars where silence had weight and meaning, poems about the idea that every living thing in the galaxy was made from the same ancient light, just expressed differently. "That is beautiful," he said. 92% power. Almost there." "Cade." "Yes?" "I need you to come back from this." He was quiet for a moment. "I will do my best, princess. That is all I have ever been able to promise anyone." 95%. "Kareth, confirm targeting solution." "Targeting solution confirmed. Bearing is optimal. You are clear to fire at full power." The bombardment array on the capital ship flared to maximum charge. I could see it on the sensors, a spike of energy that meant the weapon was seconds from firing. 60,000 people. The children in the shelter, the soldiers on the perimeter, the elderly woman Cade had carried from the burning building, the young girl who had watched him fight and heal and fight again. All of them were heartbeats away from becoming ash. Firing. The mass driver discharged with a sound that I felt in my bones more than heard. The building shook. The sensors tracked the projectile. A dense mass of refined ore accelerated to a velocity that turned simple metal into something approaching a force of nature. It climbed through the atmosphere on a column of electromagnetic energy and broke free into the vacuum of space, a streak of light that arced toward the capital ship's engine cluster with the inevitability of gravity. For 2 seconds, nothing happened. Then the capital ship's point defense systems detected the incoming projectile and opened fire. Energy beams lanced down from orbit, targeting the mass driver platform, targeting the projectile, targeting anything that might stop the kinetic payload from reaching its destination. The platform took a direct hit. I heard the impact through the comm, a roar of shattered metal and superheated air. I heard Cade's voice cut out mid-syllable, and then the sensors showed me something that made me forget how to breathe. The projectile struck the capital ship's engine cluster. The impact was catastrophic. The kinetic energy released at orbital velocity shattered the engine housing, ignited the fuel reserves, and sent a cascade failure rippling through the dreadnought's power systems. The ship broke apart in orbit, pieces of it tumbling away in slow, spinning arcs, trailing fire and debris. The bombardment array went dark. The weapon died. The colony survived. I screamed Cade's name into the comm. Static. White noise. The empty hiss of a dead connection. 3 seconds passed. 5. 10. The longest seconds of my life, and I have lived through some long ones. Then the static cracked, and I heard a sound that I will remember until the universe itself forgets how to make light. A cough, a groan, and then a voice, wrecked and barely audible, roughened by pain and smoke, and the particular quality of someone who has just survived something that should have killed them. Still here, princess. Takes more than that. I did not realize I was crying until I felt the tears on my face. Dravari do not cry the way humans do. Our tears are cold, almost crystalline, and they form at the corners of our eyes like tiny prisms. I had never cried in front of anyone in my life. I did not care. I stood in the command station, with tears forming at the corners of my eyes, and I did not care who saw. Cade had survived behind a collapsed section of the platform's structural housing. He was hurt, badly. The medical team that reached him reported fractures, burns, shrapnel wounds, and what they described with typical Dravari understatement as significant soft tissue damage. But he was alive. He was breathing. He was talking. When they brought him down to the medical station, the children from the shelter came out to see him. They had heard the explosion, had felt the ground shake, and they had been told that the human had stopped the fire from the sky. They stood in a quiet cluster around his stretcher, watching him with wide eyes that held no fear, no doctrine, no centuries of carefully cultivated dread. They looked at him the way children look at someone who has kept them safe. One of them, a girl barely past her first growth cycle, reached out and touched his hand. His fingers closed gently around hers, and he smiled. I stood at the edge of the medical station and watched, and I felt the last piece of the old architecture fall away. It did not crash, it did not shatter, it simply dissolved, like frost in morning light, and what remained was something cleaner and more honest than anything that had been there before. The Dravari fleet arrived 14 hours later. They found the colony intact. The Vrethic ground forces had been routed in the hours following the capital ship's destruction, their morale shattered by the loss of their orbital support. The garrison, organized and led by a human combat medic with 3 broken ribs and burns across 40% of his arms, had held every defensive line until the fleet's arrival. The fleet commander was speechless. The intelligence officers were baffled. The political advisors were already trying to rewrite the narrative, to minimize the human's role, to reshape the story into something that fit the doctrine. I stopped them. I returned to Asara with Cade still recovering in the medical bay of the fleet's hospital ship. I walked into the full court of the sovereignty, the same obsidian hall where I had first seen him dragged in chains across the floor, and I stood before my father the sovereign, before Dreth and Seleth, and every minor noble and military commander and political functionary who had built their careers on the certainty that humans were monsters. And I dismantled it. Not with anger, not with accusations, with testimony. I told them what I had seen, every detail, every moment, every impossible contradiction. I told them about a human who fought with the ferocity their archives had documented, and then knelt in the rubble to comfort a child who was not his species, who was not his responsibility, who was no one to him except a person who needed help. I told them about a combat medic who walked onto an exposed platform with no shielding to fire a repurposed mining tool at a warship in orbit, because the alternative was allowing 60,000 strangers to die, and who had done it, not for glory or strategy or any of the motivations they attributed to humans, but because it was the right thing to do, and he was the one who could do it. The question was never killer or redeemer, I told them. My voice was steady. I had practiced this speech in my mind during the long flight home, turning it over and over like a stone in my hand, until every edge was smooth and every word carried exactly the weight I intended. The question was whether we had the courage to look at a species that could be both and recognize that as something not to fear, but to stand beside. For 200 cycles, we have hidden behind a doctrine that told us humans were simple, predators, monsters, creatures defined by their capacity for violence. That doctrine was not just wrong. It was a deliberate blindfold, and we tied it over our own eyes because the truth was harder to look at than the lie. I turned to face my father. The sovereign sat on the throne of Asara, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that would have made me flinch a week ago. I did not flinch now. I had been flinched clean of flinching. Open diplomatic channels with humanity, I said. Not because they are safe, not because they are gentle, not because they are anything less dangerous than everything we feared. Open channels because they are all of those things and more, and because a galaxy that has a species like that in it, and refuses to know them, is a galaxy that has chosen ignorance over understanding, and we are better than that. The sovereign was silent for a long time. The court held its breath. And then my father, the ruler of the Dravari sovereignty, the architect of the doctrine, the man who had built his empire on the certainty that humans were the enemy, nodded. "Open the channels," he said. I visited Cade in the medical bay that evening. He was sitting up in bed, his torso wrapped in bandages, his arms covered in regenerative patches. A young Dravari nurse was adjusting his medication, and she looked at me with an expression that I recognized, because I had felt it myself. The expression of someone whose understanding of the universe had been expanded against their will, and who was still trying to figure out where to put the new pieces. "I heard your speech," Cade said. The nurse translated the broadcast for me. And I think you give us too much credit. Humans are not as noble as you made us sound. You are not as monstrous as my people made you sound either. The truth is somewhere in between. That is what makes you interesting." He laughed, and then winced because laughing hurt his broken ribs. "Interesting. I suppose that is better than terrifying." "It is not better or worse. It is more accurate, and accuracy matters." I sat beside his bed, and we talked. Not about the battle, or the doctrine, or the political implications of what had happened. We talked about poetry, and stars, and the sound that wind makes when it moves through the crystal formations on Asara. We talked like two people who had survived something together, and found, on the other side of it, that the distance between their species was not a wall, but a bridge that neither of them had known how to look for until they stopped being afraid. He did not shatter my beliefs. That is what I told the court. But it was not entirely accurate. Beliefs are frameworks, structures built from assumptions and reinforced by repetition. What Cade Harlow did was not shatter them. He walked through them. He walked through every wall I had built between myself and the truth about his species, not with force, but with the simple, devastating act of being exactly what he was. A human, complete, violent and gentle, terrifying and beautiful. A killer who heals. A healer who kills. A contradiction that is not a contradiction at all, but the fullest expression of what it means to be alive. He shattered the cage they had built around my mind, and when I finally saw humanity clearly, violent, gentle, terrifying, beautiful, I understood that the galaxy had never had a monster at its gates. It had a mirror, and we were too afraid to look.